Good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast. Good morning to those of you on the West Coast or the Central Time Zone. We have a blessing and an honor of having a special guest today. Really, of all the various briefings we've had over the course of the last 115 days, he was by far the most popular, and that is Dr. Jonathan Schanzer. Dr. Schanzer will go down in history as one of those working in the Treasury Department that was one who monitored the sanctions on Iran and many, many bad actors and prevented Iran from accruing the billions of dollars to be used for nefarious purposes. Today, Dr. Schanzer plays an integral role and there are governments all across the world that speak to him, that reach out to him for information, as he works as he's one of the fellows of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. For us, the family of the Friends of the IDF, it's a blessing and an honor to have Dr. Schanzer with us. Unfortunately for all of us, over the course of the weekend, there's been some very, very disconcerting news. There's some very, very difficult issues that have come up. And unfortunately, Dr. Schanzer has a huge, huge pile of issues to speak about and to address that we're confronting this week. And without further ado, I want to hand it over to Dr. Schanzer. Jonathan, thank you so much for addressing us. Thank you for being with us.
It's my absolute pleasure, and I want to thank you for just the opportunity to speak with this audience and to thank you for all that you do. I have a number of things that I plan on covering here today, and I'll just go through them one at a time and explain what we're watching, what we're concerned about, and maybe a little bit about what we think may be on the horizon. But first, let me start with some breaking news. There are reports coming out of the Middle East right now that 3 American service members were killed in a drone strike in Jordan. This is obviously a serious escalation. It's terrible news, obviously, for the United States and for the free world. The attacks come in the midst of 135 other attacks, perhaps even more than that, carried out by Iran-backed militias in both Syria and Iraq. We've seen these attacks against American bases now since, I think the first one was October 17th. So just 10 days after the 10/7 slaughter, the Iranians began trying to force the United States to withdraw from the Middle East. That really was the, I think, intended message here, is that you're not welcome here and that we're going to harass you until you leave. The U.S. has responded to the attacks in Iraq and Syria with, by my count, 8 different reprisals, 8 different responses. That's clearly not enough, and it's certainly not enough, I think, to deter Iran or any of those proxies that continue to attack. And unfortunately, I would say that the attack on our troops today was actually somewhat predictable in light of the lack of deterrence that we'd established. Now, it's a little bit different in Yemen, where the Houthis, another Shiite militia sponsored by the Iranians, have been attacking the U.S., obviously, as well as international vessels transiting the Red Sea, a crucial waterway for trade, in particular, going to Europe. And the U.S. has obviously responded in kind to the Houthis. There have been attacks in Yemen. There have been operations to repel Houthi violence and aggression on the Red Sea. But this absolutely, I think, changes the equation. The Biden administration is going to have to make some tough choices here about how to respond to the Iranian militias right now in Iraq and Syria and perhaps elsewhere. And of course, the timing is bad, right? The timing for the Biden administration, the last thing they want to do is to announce an uptick in American operations in an election year. Right? This is something that I think that Biden's base and the Democratic Party, certainly for those who maybe identify as neo-isolationists or isolationists in either party, in the Democratic or Republican parties, they will not welcome the idea of America going back into the Middle East and getting more involved. But again, it's hard to imagine the U.S. not responding in a serious way from today's attacks. So that's kind of that's the breaking news, and it's also some bad news we'll have to continue to watch. Now, in terms of good news, the big story this weekend is UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency. This is a UN agency that for years, for decades, has actually been part of the problem, not part of the solution. For those who need a quick refresher in history, this is an agency that was created in the immediate aftermath of Israel's War of Independence. And, initially it was just designed to help deal with the Palestinian refugee problem of some 600,000 or so Palestinians that lost their homes during the original war, which of course was launched by the Palestinians and surrounding Arab states. Well, when Israel won that war, these people found themselves without homes and in need of assistance. The problem that ultimately evolved out of UNRWA's operations was that they appeared to be more committed to perpetuating the refugee problem than solving it. So in other words, what's happened over the years is UNRWA has actually recognized the descendants of those original 600,000 refugees, to the point that today there are 5.9 million people who are claiming refugee status. These are the children, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren of those original refugees, who now probably number, if you read Mike Pompeo's tweets from 2021, he said there were less than 200,000. My guess is that it's actually even less than that. I'll bet that it's under 50 or maybe even less than 30,000 of those original refugees who've simply grown old and passed away over the years. So UNRWA has created a problem that it now has, it's been exacerbated so much so that you have entire generations of Palestinians who believe that they're going to return to their homes from 1948, and that is just simply not acceptable. But now we know that things are even worse than that, because as UNRWA became more and more committed to the Palestinian cause, we began to see that they were involved in the military operations of what Hamas has been doing in the Gaza Strip since it took control there in 2007. So what we're watching there is a massive amount of involvement in terms of allowing for Hamas to store weapons in UNRWA facilities like schools and hospitals. We're seeing that Hamas has been firing rockets from within the compounds of UNRWA facilities. And we've seen tunnels, those commando tunnels that are operating below the ground in Gaza, sneaking under UNRWA facilities as well. And so now we've learned, this is intelligence that the IDF and the Israelis have just released, that there are at least a dozen UNRWA fighters, UNRWA employees, rather, that have been associated with Hamas. They were fighters on behalf of Hamas. On 10/7, we know that there is at least one person that was involved in keeping some of the hostages in their home. So now all of a sudden the Israelis have released information about UNRWA. It's quite damning. UNRWA has admitted to the problem. And now we see that the US and Finland and the Netherlands and the UK, Australia, Canada, everyone is starting to halt their funding to UNRWA. This is good news. Now, the big question is, how do we leverage this? How do we make sure that UNRWA stops its operations inside Gaza permanently? They should stop their operations permanently in the West Bank as well, where I think their influence is malign. And so we continue to see this. This is really just negative news all around for UNRWA, positive news, I think, for Israel, if it can leverage this crisis. And so now really we're going to see whether the US is prepared to push for a serious change. Now, some other good news that we're tracking out of the Middle East right now are protests that were recorded in Gaza. I believe it was on Friday, maybe it was on Thursday. The reports are a little fuzzy there, but the Palestinians that were leaving Khan Yunis, the fighting in Khan Yunis, and they were moving to other places that Israel had declared to be safer zones, they began chanting for Hamas to release the hostages. Now, that's pretty amazing right now to see the people of Gaza beginning to turn against the people that have ruled them since 2007. Now, the Israelis have been playing this video nonstop on the television channels that I've been watching, and I can say that it's very positive that this is happening. On the other hand, is it really a trend? Was this just a couple hundred people? Do they really represent the way that most Gazans think? And are most Gazans willing to turn this into something more than just an isolated protest? Those are questions I don't know how to answer, but a potentially good sign of things to come. Another possible positive piece of news, we'll have to see how the Israeli government responds to this, is that hostage families are actually blocking the trucks that are trying to bring material into the Gaza Strip. Now, I am not suggesting that it's necessarily a positive thing that the people of Gaza, don't get all the things that they need in terms of humanitarian supplies. But the hostage families are basically saying this: we're going to let these things come through, right? Whether it's food or medical supplies or what have you, but that they're saying that the Hamas authorities, or what's left of them, that they need to do their part, that this should be a quid pro quo, that in order for this stuff to come in, they're saying, well, you've got to start releasing hostages. And they are making that demand very clearly. And so they are blocking these trucks. They're standing in front of the passages. And I think they're very brave to do so. Interestingly, Prime Minister Netanyahu has actually said that this is potentially harmful to the negotiations. I'm not sure I agree with him. It really does look like that they are giving the Israelis some leverage vis-a-vis Hamas. And it's, by the way, I think a really powerful message to send to the people of Gaza and to the rest of the Arab world, that they expect there to be something in response for Israel bringing in all of this material. Now, some dangerous news that has been reported this morning that I am tracking, and I'm very troubled by it, is that there are reports in the U.S. press, I believe it was first publicized by NBC News, that the Biden administration is considering the slowing of weapons deliveries to Israel. As everyone knows, as part of the alliance structures that have been established between Israel and the United States, that the Israelis rely heavily on U.S. weaponry. And the U.S. has been delivering what is called in Hebrew, rakevet tachmoshet, literally the ammunition train. It's actually an airlift, not a train, obviously. It's going to go overseas, but this airlift, the series of airlifts have kept the Israelis going. It's enabled the IDF to target something like 30,000 different targets since the war on 10/7 began. If we want to see that continue in any significant way, then obviously there needs to be an arrangement between the U.S. and Israel. If the U.S. begins to revise the terms of that and slows down the fighting, this could have a very dangerous impact on Israel's ability to A, dismantle and destroy Hamas, and B, to keep the leverage that it needs in order to negotiate the release of those hostages. Now, a separate issue that Steve and I have chatted about over the last couple of weeks, and something that I've been tracking at FDD, is that there is a possible rupture brewing between Israel and Egypt. You're not hearing a lot about it right now, but the Egyptians have warned the Israelis not to operate on the Rafah crossing, or as the Israelis call it, Rafiah. This is a town that is that actually is split across the border between Egypt and Gaza. The Israelis know that they have to operate, at least on the Gaza side of the border, after they're done with the fighting in Khan Yunis, in order to dismantle really the last bastion of Hamas military strength. Now, I think what we're beginning to see here is the brewing of a crisis, primarily because I expect, and I've heard this from folks that I've talked to in Israel, that there are going to be tunnels that snake between the Gaza Strip and Egypt. Egypt, once upon a time, in the immediate aftermath of the revolution or the coup that brought Abdel Fattah al-Sisi to power, he began flooding a lot of those tunnels with sewage water and destroying them with explosives. Now we're hearing that maybe not all of those tunnels have been destroyed. Now, the big question is, how much did Egypt know and how much was it involved? I believe that the Egyptians are warning the Israelis not to operate along the border because they don't want the full extent of those tunnels to be made public. They don't want to be embarrassed. And the Israelis, I think, have no choice but to move ahead because of their war aim of destroying Hamas. So we need to watch this one carefully. This is, of course, the longest standing peace agreement that Israel enjoys in the Middle East. It's been very important for Israeli security. As the saying goes, this is the old adage in the Middle East, as Egypt goes, so goes the rest of the Middle East. Now, of course, that was coined when Egypt was a much more powerful player in the region. Today, it's racked by economic challenges and political challenges, but still, it is a crucial player in the region with one of the largest militaries in the region. The Israelis do not need to see a rupture there. So we'll be watching that one carefully. Another rupture that I think is already, unfortunately, underway is with Jordan. The rhetoric that we have seen from Jordan over the last 10 months, maybe even 2 years, if we really want to go back and look long enough, it's been really, really anti-Israel. The anti-Israel rhetoric has just been, and it's been voiced not just by the people. You know, we always talk about the cold peace that exists with Egypt. At least the leadership has expressed, you know, a certain amount of, I don't want to say warmth, but a professional relationship with the Israelis. The Jordanians, we don't see that at all. The king, the foreign minister, the royal court, the rhetoric has been incredibly harsh. I actually wrote a research memo for FDD about this in late 2022. The name of that memo, for those interested, was Neither Here Nor There, Jordan and the Abraham Accords. And you just got a sense that the Jordanians, especially when you compared them to the UAE and Bahrain and others that have normalized with Israel in recent years, that Jordan is really an outlier. And you may have seen this week, there was a restaurant that was exposed in the Israeli press. They call themselves the October 7th restaurant, literally celebrating the pogrom carried out by Hamas on October 7th. Just outrageous. And the Jordanian government didn't do anything about it until it became public, and the outrage was so palpable that they forced the restaurant to take down its sign. But the Jordanian government has been helping the South Africans build their case against Israel at The Hague. They've been advisors to the legal case, that farcical case about genocide that was partially rejected by the court at The Hague at the ICJ. But yet aspects of that case are still ongoing. So, and then, by the way, this week, we even saw a report that Israel, in response to some of their rhetoric, said that they were considering an end to the agreement where Israel has been supplying water to the Jordanians. Crucial for the Jordanians in order to keep their people satisfied with sufficient water in a country that lacks that resource. By the way, the Israelis also provide natural gas. They provide intelligence. They provide a whole range of services that actually help keep Jordan safe. And the Jordanians have responded with the kind of rhetoric that I've described here. It is outrageous. It should not be happening. And I hope, anyway, that the Jordanians and Israelis finally sort this out, and Jordan perhaps just ratchets down some of that nasty rhetoric that we've been seeing. Hostage deal. That is in the news as well right now. A lot of people are talking about the fact that there could be something in the works. This is being brokered primarily between Bill Burns, the head of the CIA, and Dadi Barnea, the head of the Mossad in Israel, but the Qataris and the Egyptians are also involved. Look, I'll just say this. I certainly would welcome any deal that would release those remaining hostages, the 130 or so hostages that are being held against their will by Hamas. But just remember, the Qataris are state sponsors of Hamas. They are looking out for Hamas first. They're looking out for the survival of Hamas first and foremost. At probably the most dangerous moment in this terror group's history, they are on the verge of getting demolished by Israel. And so the Qataris, if they do broker a deal, are very likely to try to broker one that would benefit Hamas. And so it's for that reason that I say that we should be very wary of whatever deal is being brokered. I don't like the motivations of the primary broker here. And look, I think it's worth noting that Israel's two war aims, the war aims that have been expressed by the IDF spokesperson and by the defense minister and by the prime minister himself, the idea of defeating Hamas on the one hand and freeing the hostages on the other, those two war aims are in friction to some extent. We need to be aware of that. Doesn't mean that Israel should be working toward both simultaneously and using one as leverage for the other, but just be aware you may not see the complete demolition of Hamas if a deal is struck that would give Hamas 2 to 4 or 6 months of a pause in fighting, that probably won't benefit Israel in terms of its other war aims. So we need to keep a wider eye on that. I'll just conclude here by saying that there's one entity that has not gotten a lot of attention in our media amidst the ongoing wars in Gaza and in Lebanon, where, of course, a wider war is potentially brewing, very dangerous war potentially brewing. Israel, by the way, is getting, I think, the better of Hezbollah in most of those exchanges. But don't forget that Hezbollah has something like 200,000 rockets and precision munitions that can be used against Israel. But when we look at their firepower, when we look at Hamas's firepower, when we look at the firepower of those Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria, likely one of those groups just attacked American troops in Jordan and killed those 3 servicemen. When we look at the weaponry being wielded by the Houthis in the Red Sea, all of it comes from one place. It comes from Iran. The Islamic Republic has yet to pay a serious price for the mayhem that it has caused. We are watching a regional war brew right now in the Middle East, and the primary culprit for all of this has yet to pay any price, right? Every one of the proxies have been dealt with to some extent or another, and most of the analysis is about those proxies. It is not about really how we want to weaken the regime in Iran. That should be something that Israel is focused on. It should be something that the United States is focused on. And really any other government in the world that is looking to try to sustain any level of calm in the region, it must be noted that Iran is the address for any response. Now, I'll just end here. I want to thank you. I thank Steve and thank all of you for being part of such a terrific organization. I'll just note in conclusion that this week was Holocaust Remembrance Week. And this is, of course, something highly significant for anyone who believes in the safety and security of the Jewish state, the need for a Jewish state to ensure that something like the Holocaust never occurs again. But I would also note here that we continue to see, even here in the United States and certainly abroad, we see instances of Holocaust denial, but then more recently, we continue to see things that I would only describe as 10/7 denial. People that say that it was a false flag operation, or that Israel conducted these attacks against themselves, or they've lied about the murder or the rape of Israeli women, or the abuse or killing of Israeli kids, the mutilation of Jewish bodies. The fact that these things are still being denied is a sign that anti-Semitism is, of course, alive and well in the United States and around the world. There are no permanent victories here, folks. There are only permanent battles. This is something that FDD's president, Cliff May, often says, and I think it's important to invoke that here. Those are my concluding remarks. I thank you again for the opportunity to speak with you, and certainly look forward to doing it again sometime soon. Thank you.
Jonathan, could we ask you a number of questions? Would that be okay?
Of course. Yeah.
The Wall Street Journal report that says that there's somewhere between 60 to 80% of the tunnels under Gaza are still extant, now that they see that it's over 400 miles of tunnels. So on the one hand, let's assume that's the case. Is that significant or not significant? Meaning, many of these tunnels that Israel has dealt with, you have a situation where they've really taken out the major arteries of the tunnels. What's left, is that significant, or is that not significant from your perspective?
Look, the existence of these tunnels is significant on 2 levels. One is, obviously, the Israelis, if they're trying to find the hostages and if they're trying to find the fighters, this makes it that much more difficult, right? I mean, it means that there is a lot that they cannot see, and they don't have it all mapped, which makes it also extremely difficult. I know the IDF is trying to map out this tunnel system, as they call it, the metro, but it is going to take some time to get it all mapped out. And while they're doing so, that's going to put IDF personnel at risk if they don't know where they're going as they go underground. As these engineers and special forces go in, they put themselves at risk to Hamas fighters and fire. They also are at risk of the booby traps and the unpleasant surprises that Hamas has left waiting for them. But then there comes, I think, another question that needs to be answered, which is how long will it take to destroy these tunnels long term? Let's just say, for the sake of argument, and I hope we get there, that the bulk of the heavy fighting ends with the conclusion of operations in Khan Yunis in central southern Gaza, and then the IDF moves further south against the objections of the Egyptians in order to neutralize what's going on in Rafah, both above and below ground. You know, after that, the Israelis have described what they say will be a cleanup operation, taking care of all of the existing infrastructure, the military infrastructure that Hamas built over the years with Iranian and Turkish and Qatari financial assistance. That's going to take a long time. These things are not structurally sound. The Israelis are being asked to try to preserve as much infrastructure above ground as they can. And so the engineering corps has a lot of work ahead of them. And that is going to extend the period of time where the IDF will need to be operating as the sole guarantor of security in the Gaza Strip. This is not something that is negotiable from Israel's perspective. So we could be looking at 6 months to a year of operations, maybe even longer than that, in order to destroy these 350, 400 miles of tunnels that you've just described.
I mean, the positive is, if 20 to 30% has been taken out in the most difficult circumstances, in the context of war, if it takes another 9 to 10 months to take out the majority of it, what's remaining, the 70 to 80%, it seems that that's something that's doable. Although it's not, as you said, it's not something that can be done overnight. It's something that will take a consistent, sustained approach.
Yeah, I think that the timetable is going to be the thing that creates friction between Israel and the United States, Israel and the international community, right? This sort of, public relations battle that Israel's, been drawn into. It's not like Israel went looking for this, but as it's, started to defend itself, it's found itself under attack, and that's likely to continue for every day that Israel finds itself in the Gaza Strip operating militarily. And then I think, there's some, potentially some other complications that come out of this as well. Specifically, let's just say, for example, that Israel requires that, 6 months to a year or more of operating in Gaza. That kind of time gives Hamas the ability, assuming they're able to resurrect the tunnels that Israel destroys and they're able to bring in additional military material. What worries me is the potential for an insurgency of sorts, right? We saw that with the United States in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. It's possible that, that could be done in a similar way against Israel. Now, I think the circumstances are a little bit different because Israel really has kept its own borders airtight with Gaza, as opposed to what we saw in Iraq or Afghanistan, where the borders were very porous and open. But there will still be that Philadelphia corridor between Gaza and Egypt. And that's the one, again, I continue to watch that. I am really a little nervous here about the extent to which Hamas can keep those tunnels operating and the extent to which Israel can actually fight against them effectively. And this is going to require that coordination between Egypt and Israel. And right now, they don't seem to be on the same page. To keep Gaza secure, Israel and Egypt need to figure out how to handle that tunnel problem and make sure that it doesn't come back again.
The next question we'd like to ask you is your analysis of what's happened with Jordan. And part of that is a function of that he essentially is beholden to the Palestinian majority that he's got there. He's got a Palestinian wife who's a rabid anti-Semite. He's got a weak military situation where he's dependent upon Israel and America, and he can't look as weak as he really is. So that's part of the factor. But my question would be this. In a world when there's an Abraham Accords, and there is Saudi Arabia and 5 or 6 other Muslim countries that join the Abraham Accords, if he doesn't stop that behavior and he doesn't put an end to it. Could we see a world where Israel decides to hand over the Muslim holy sites to Saudi Arabia and make them the custodian as opposed to Jordan?
I mean, look, I think that is feasible, and we've certainly seen reports and suggestions that such a thing could occur. I think once that happens, though, you will see a complete rupture in the relationship between Jordan and Israel. And I don't think Israel wants that. I mean, I think, everyone in kind of the US-led world order understands that Jordan plays an important role as a buffer between Israel and the rest of the Arab world. And that the stability of Jordan is ultimately incredibly influential in terms of the stability of the West Bank and then by extension stability in Israel. So nobody wants to see this relationship collapse. But what I would warn here is that the Jordanians are allowing themselves to go down the path where such a collapse is imaginable. In other words, engaging in the kind of rhetoric and the attacks and the ongoing blood libels that they have, forwarded out there when it comes to Israel. I mean, almost every Ramadan in recent memory, I can recall. And by the way, Ramadan's coming on March 11th. That is one to keep an eye out for, because that's usually when the rhetoric gets out of control. And that's usually when we see the kind of unrest in the West Bank and in Jerusalem itself. So I'm watching that as a marker for the future. But I'm watching the Jordanians because they don't seem to understand that their security, that their future is tied to that of Israel in large part, right? They get assistance from the United States for sustaining this relationship, and the Israelis give them all that help that I just mentioned, and yet the king continues to talk about Israel as if they are the problem. Actually, remarkably, there was a report it was in our mainstream media just about a week and a half ago that the Jordanians were striking with their air force Iran-backed drug dealers in Syria, that these Iranian militias had been working with narcos to bring a drug called Captagon into Jordan, and the Jordanians began to strike. And so here you have the Jordanians actually at war with Iran-backed actors, and the Israelis are fighting Iran-backed actors. And this whole adage of my enemy of my enemy of my friend, that seems to be lost on the Jordanians right now. They don't seem to understand that they are fighting the same battles as the United States and Israel right now. And now that we've seen the attack against these US servicemen, you'd think that this would even sharpen their minds even more. I've yet to see evidence of that. Maybe today's attack will help change their perspectives, but that's not what the evidence has shown over the last several years.
In terms of the Hezbollah, this past week, they've ratcheted things up in a way that's very dangerous, going after Air Force installations, going after radar towers, etc. Israel, my understanding is, although it's not necessarily publicized, but Israel has responded in kind, both in terms of the depth that they've gone into Lebanon and in terms of the strategic targets. Would you care to elaborate on your take over what you've seen the last 10 days in Lebanon vis-a-vis Hezbollah?
Look, there's no question that Hezbollah has ratcheted up the attacks. We've seen more of them. The Israeli media says that there's been roughly 700 attacks. I think that when you look at the sheer number of rockets, missiles, and drones, I think it's probably 3 or 4 times that at the end of the day. When the Israelis talk about attacks, I think they're talking about salvos or, like sort of groups of strikes that happen in one, in kind of one fell swoop. If you look at each individual strike, it's much more than that, I believe. And Hezbollah has been doing this since October 8th, unprovoked, right? So what Hezbollah has done is they've steadily attacked the Israelis. They've not paid a significant price for it in terms of the kind of war that we saw in 2006, where it was like billions of dollars worth of damage and 1,200 people killed and Lebanon having to rebuild afterwards. We've not gotten to that point yet. But what Hezbollah has successfully done is they have established a measure of deterrence against Israel. Israel's not responded with full force. It's been restrained by the United States, by the way, and that has become very clear. This is actually one of the, even though the United States has given Israel full backing in Gaza, that may be curtailed now, according to these reports about ammunition. But the US has restrained Israel in ways that I never quite imagined, where Israel's wanted to respond to Hezbollah, and they've not been given permission, if you will, to do so. The Israelis, nonetheless, and here's where I think it's important to just know the score. The Israelis have done something remarkable during the last 3 months of fighting. The first thing that they've done is in every exchange, or almost every exchange, according to what I've heard, the Israelis sustain an attack, and that attack is usually tactical in nature. That doesn't really hurt Israel's long-term viability on the northern border. And what they do in response is they attack at the spot where they were fired upon, but then they attack another strategic target on top of that. And so what's happened is over 3 months, Israel has actually taken out a lot of strategic targets associated with Hezbollah. So Hezbollah is demonstrably weaker in the areas where Israel is struck. But what we haven't seen is Israel striking in places like Beirut, where Hezbollah has a stronghold in the town or in the neighborhood known as Dahia. We haven't seen a significant amount of activity in the Bekaa Valley. It's been mostly southern Lebanon. In southern Lebanon, by the way, the Israelis have been able to destroy a lot of the brush cover that Hezbollah would normally use to hide as they mount attacks. And so that's also been a very positive component of this. The downside of all of this, though, is that Israel's northern communities have been completely evacuated, right? 120,000 or so people that the IDF has actually asked to leave. And then there are those that have left on their own volition because they don't want to be in the line of fire either, even though they are perhaps slightly further south of the border that the Israelis have noted. So there is a real problem here that the Israelis are going to have to tackle sooner rather than later. Either Hezbollah is going to have to be forced to move north of the Litani River pursuant to UN Security Council 1701. That resolution should be the law, right? But Hezbollah has not adhered to that for years, right? Not since well before the last war in 2006. So the Israelis are working right now by firing back with overwhelming force when they can, working with the U.S. Amos Hochstein is the guy who represents us here in the U.S., as well as the French. They've been trying to convince Hezbollah to move and to set the stage for a return of the Israeli residents. In my view, and I say this with no amount of glee, I can point to very few instances in the Middle East where Iran-backed actors, terrorist organizations that are committed to Israel's destruction, will take such a measure just because they've been convinced that diplomacy is the way to go here. I just don't believe that Hezbollah will willingly move north of the Litani River, and that means that Israel at some point soon will need to follow through on some of these threats, and that we may yet see a wider war with a military that is believed by Israeli analysts that I've talked to be equal in strength to that of an average-sized European military. And so Israel would be drawn into a battle with a fighting force that the strength of which Israel has actually never tangled with, not in decades.
If that war happens, do you see that war, let me describe it this way, at least the first phases of such a war being primarily orchestrated through the Air Force? Or do you see that being a very serious ground war like we have in Gaza right now?
It's a good question. I think, air will be a significant part of it. By the way, I think cyber will be a huge component of this war as well. And then from there, there's just going to be a question. The forces that everyone's watching right now, they're called the Radwan forces. These are the ground forces that operate primarily in southern Lebanon, and they've been trained by Iran to take Israeli towns. So in other words, to do exactly what happened on 10/7, but to do so from the north. And there are questions about tunnels, and there's questions about other tactics that they might need to rely upon. But then comes the part from, I think, the question that you're asking, which is that whether there will need to be clashes between these two ground forces in order for Israel to sustain its war aims, namely to vacate Hezbollah from southern Lebanon so that its people can return. There is, I think, a better than average chance that there will be a clash between IDF forces, between, I'm guessing, Golani forces and special forces against the Radwan. And that will be quite a matchup because, again, Hezbollah has been trained. These are professional forces. They make, we always say that Hamas, as deadly as they were on 10/7, they're the JV team trained by Iran. Hezbollah is the varsity team. And this is what, again, when we look at the possibility of this conflict, it is a serious one. It will lead to hundreds, if not thousands, of Israeli dead, civilian and military alike. We could see the destruction of Israeli infrastructure. We could see, the toppling of large buildings in Tel Aviv, for that matter, given some of the precision weapons that Hezbollah has in its possession. So we look at all this, it's extremely disconcerting. It's a war that nobody wants, but there are, I would say, a pretty significant number of people inside the IDF and within the Israeli security apparatus who are saying, look, we're mobilized right now. The morale of the IDF, the morale of the reservists, the morale of the people, it's high. They're already spending the money to keep the military mobilized. As long as the ammunition flows, that perhaps this is the moment to take advantage of this. It's not, again, not what anybody wanted, but we're living in a post 10/7 mentality, right? There is no going back to 10/6, is what we continue to hear from the Israelis. And it's for that reason I still think that there's probably a 50-50 chance of this war breaking out. Now, the big question is whether Hezbollah wants it. There is an argument that says that Hezbollah will not deploy unless it is defending the Iranian regime itself, that the Iranian regime is under threat. And that is ultimately why they are there, as an insurance policy for when Iran breaks out with its nuclear program, or when Israel decides to start striking the regime inside Iran, or the United States tries to start striking the regime in Iran, that Hezbollah would become activated. There is that school of thought. Then there's the other school of thought that says that Hezbollah was created for one reason and one reason only, and that is to destroy Israel. And if that's the case, then, that's the battle we'll watch.
Very disconcerting. Yeah, we're in a very difficult time. I think that the difference between where we are today and where we were 4 months ago is at least we're aware of these realities. At least we're psychologically prepared for these realities. But it's not an easy time.
I think that's right. But I do think that it's better to be living in reality, knowing the threats that surround Israel. And by the way, I think the reality is starting to come home here, right? When you see 3 servicemen killed this morning, this is an indication that the U.S., I think, has also not been realistic about the enemy that we face. The Israelis and the U.S., I think, look, to be fair, the Israelis were warning the United States for years now that making deals with the regime in Iran was dangerous. But we can now see that the Israelis made deals with themselves. They made deals with the Qataris. They made deals with the United States to try to contain this problem. Containing does not seem to be an option anymore. And I think this is the big paradigm shift as the Israelis look to actively confront the threats that surround them. I think that's probably a positive step at the end of the day, even though the perils are increasingly clear.
Jonathan, thank you. Thank you for your openness, for your analysis, for your perspective. And on behalf of all of us, the friends of the IDF, we're grateful to you. We're grateful to FDD and what FDD is doing. And we want to wish you a good week. And look, our prayers and our hearts are for the people of Israel, for the soldiers, our American servicemen. Over 25 already have been injured, not to mention the 3 that were killed. It's a very difficult time. And we pray and we hope for a better world. Thank you.